Hello, everyone. I am Scott Walter, the president of Capital Research Center. This is part of the new and expanded Capital Research Center work that we're doing, including with Mike Hartmann here, who is both a senior fellow and the director of our Center for Strategic Giving. But you're lucky you don't have me running the show. You have somebody much better, and that's Bill Schambra, a senior fellow of the Hudson Institute and known to many of you for his great work in panels just like this, including with some of these same people over the years at the Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal at the Hudson Institute. So we want to thank all our distinguished guests for coming, and take it away, Bill.
Okay, thank you, Scott. As Scott indicated, my name is Bill Schambra, and on behalf of the Capital Research Center, I'd like to welcome you to today's panel to discuss a new study published by CRC on the political and charitable effects of a decision handed down by the United States Supreme Court on January 21, 2010, entitled Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. Just 6 days after that decision, in his 2010 State of the Union address, President Obama noted of the decision that, quote, the Supreme Court reversed a century of law to open the floodgates for special interests to spend without limit in our elections. Well, he continued, I don't think American elections should be bankrolled by America's most powerful interests. And if you recall, that broadcast cameras at that point cut away to a shot of the United States Supreme Court sitting directly in front of President Obama, and they captured Justice Alito shaking his head from side to side and mouthing, not true. From the moment of its decision, now 8 years ago, and in spite of the omnipresence of the phrase, in the wake of Citizens United, we in fact don't know all we should about that case's effect on American politics, which is why this study we will discuss today is so timely and useful. Its author, Mike Hartmann, alongside whom I had the pleasure of working for a number of years at the Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee, will discuss his findings shortly. But our intention isn't really to focus so narrowly on a discussion of the numbers and the data and how do you did you count this and that right. It's really to discuss the possible effects of Citizens United in its broadest sense. That is, we're interested not just in political campaign-related expenses as such, but as well in the enormous flows of dollars around political campaigns within what we traditionally regard as the charitable sector among nonprofits and foundations. To tackle such a broad range of issues, we've gathered a knowledgeable panel of experts from whom we'll hear. After Mike summarizes his findings, we'll hear first, after Mike, from David Keating, president of the Institute for Free Speech, whose involvement in the case Speech Now versus Federal Election Commission opened the door for the creation of the so-called SuperPACs. Then we'll hear from Abby Levine, director of the Bolder Advocacy Initiative, the Alliance for Justice. I realized just a couple of days ago that my former employer, the Hudson Institute, held a panel on Citizens United just a month after that decision. And not only was the Alliance for Justice a co-sponsor, but in fact, Abby was on that panel. And finally, we'll hear from Gara LaMarche, president of the Democracy Alliance, whose presence on the panel allows me to note that simply toting up and comparing contributions according to ideological classifications may occasionally be misleading. When Gara was president of Atlantic Philanthropies, I was proud to claim him as a financial supporter of the work of Hudson Institute's Bradley Center. And though it's safe to say we're on different sides of most of the political questions of the day, it's certainly true that we both value the sort of civilized discussion about nonprofit issues upon which we will enter today. So Mike, why don't you take it away and let me remind you, as I need reminding myself, to turn off your phones. I apparently did not do that. There. It's a forward from Kevin Nunes. I wonder what that's all about.
Well. Thanks, Bill, and thanks to the panel for doing this. We appreciate your time, and thanks for coming. I will be brief. I did work at Bradley for Bill Schambra a long time ago. I was trying to get fired the whole time, but he was too nice a guy, as some of you may have picked up on. Bradley, of course, a private non-operating foundation that can only give to 501c3 organizations. I'll speak for both of us for a minute, if that's okay. We thought the kind of support Bradley could give, that kind of support, to C3 public charities interested in public policy for the most part in Bradley's case, could greatly benefit the country. It's considered a conservative foundation, and it is, and we thought, in particular, you know, conservative policy groups could do a lot of good. Bradley was known for providing mostly general operating support to what was called externally, and then even internally after a while, the conservative intellectual infrastructure. This infrastructure underlay the development of conservative ideas and then the implementation of policies based on them, and the discussion about those policies and whether they were good and effective. Bradley achieved some successes in the context of school choice, welfare reform, the revitalization of civil society, and it continues to plug away on those issues as well as others that you would recognize as being on the roster of any conservative foundation interested in policy, to include the rule of law, limited government, higher education reform. This was all part of a long-term worldview that the foundation, its top staff and the board possessed, with a toleration to endure ups and downs on that long road. The patience was tested, and there were frustrating days, but it is the case that there was a long-term worldview. I think it's fair to say. And now I'll stop speaking for both of us, if that's okay, and speak just from here for a minute. Starting in the teens, after Citizens United, maybe not necessarily because of it, I guess we'll talk about that. I certainly thought I was detecting an increased interest among all givers, including conservative ones, to be more short-term in outlook. This may or may not have been a good thing, but were it the case, I think it'd be worth noting and taking into account as decisions would be made regarding where to give, how to give, to whom to give, to which groups to give. This included giving to politics if one was in a position to choose among the three flows that I'm going to want to be talking about here. This included giving to politics directly in the form of campaigns or to the independent groups that grew, of which there were more in the wake of the Citizens United and Speech Now decisions. And as I said, if it were the case that money that would have gone to the type of C3s with which we were familiar to these other new groups, you know, that would be one worth knowing, and then maybe two evaluating. And there might have been benefits, but there might also have been drawbacks about which one should be aware. So I just wanted to see if maybe information could be gathered about that to inform discussions about it with givers. And I'm not sure we did it, but we tried with help from Mike Watson at CRC, good researcher there, co-host of Influence Watch, a podcast from CRC to which you should all gain access. So here's what we did. Again, so I'm looking to see if there's displacement of support for policy-oriented C3s, what I'm calling traditional public policy organizations, by support sort of instead for the newly enlarged independent groups. So politics directly, campaigns, independent groups, traditional policy-oriented C3s. Let's just speak briefly about politics directly, money to campaigns. I am no campaign finance expert, which will become clear if it isn't already. To me, that's why David Keating is here, and then the whole panel knows about this. But if you just tote up the numbers, I'm just toting, we just toted, if that's okay. Take the two full 2-year cycles before Citizens United, add up federal and state numbers, which you can do on the basis of reported data to the FEC and state agencies, and compare it with the total federal and state campaign receipts in the 2 full 2-year cycles post-Citizens United, there was an increase in campaign receipts from about 8.4 before to 8.9 afterwards. These are unadjusted for inflation. The Republicans went from about 3.8 to 4.7, and you know the Democrats actually decreased $400,000 from 4.6 to 4.2. I think that has to do with how successful Obama was in raising money that first time he ran in '08. In the last cycle of that, I'll call it the studied period, 13-14, of all campaign receipts, federal and state, Republicans totaled about 54% of the overall amount, and Democrats about 46%. All right, so numbers regarding the independent flow, the second flow, as I'll call it here. As reported, which is all we sort of really have to go on, that increased too, obviously. Maybe not obviously, but it did. Going from about $525 million to $2 billion afterwards. So the newly enabled flow from Citizens United and Speech Now did open a spigot, I guess you could call it. I mean, I'm mixing metaphors. A spigot causes a flow. Yeah. Okay. Now on the federal level, the Center for Responsive Politics categorizes that data as being spent by a conservative group or a liberal group. It's quite helpful. Harder to do on the state level. But if you take their categorizations in that last cycle of the studied period, 56% of the overall independent flow was spent by conservative groups, 44% by liberal groups. That flow at the end of that period was about a quarter of the direct political campaign receipt flow. I'll allow others to characterize whether a quarter is a lot or not much, whether it's only a quarter or a quarter, but that's about what it was in that cycle. Okay, so the C3 flow, to go to what I had in my mind as a question and a potential concern. This is difficult to do, and with Mike Watson's help, we came up with a way to try doing it. We just compiled a list of such C3 groups interested in policies and policy reform and policy proposals and discussion about policy by looking at the grantees of specific foundations and giving entities. There's some donor-advised funds in there. We picked 6 on the right and then another 6 on the left. I think they're the ones you would pick if you want to do this. I don't think you would exclude people from the list we came up with. You might want to add more, but CRC has a limited budget, and you all need to get in touch with development officials there to help. The foundations we picked to do this with are in the report. I won't go through them, but that's what we did. And then we looked at, so we have the list of the groups on the left and the right, and we looked at the receipts of those groups for 1 year after and 1 year before to try to see if we could make a plausible trend claim and to see what might have happened. The second year was 2014 when we started the project. That was the year for which, that was the most recent year for which we think we could get enough 990s to do this. And then we picked a year equidistant in time before the Citizens United and Speech Now decision, so 2006. So 2006, 2014 receipts of 372 conservative groups, which is what we came up with when we did it this way, and more than 1,000 liberal groups. Now that doesn't speak, of course, to the size of the flow, but there were more when we did this the way that we did. So we fully realize the crudity of this exercise. It is not scientific. These are just snapshots, and we're just toting up receipts. But when one does this, total receipts of policy-oriented C3s, the selected ones, went from about 6.2 in 2006 to $9.6 billion in 2014, again unadjusted for inflation. So that's a lot of money. That $9.6 billion figure is consistent with where David Callahan of Inside Philanthropy estimated that level would be in his book, The Givers. He says he thinks it'd be, quote, in the low billions, less than $10 billion. And, you know, we came up with 9.6 with our toting up, so he was pretty good there with that estimate. As a percentage matter, there was more of an increase for the conservative groups. As a raw dollar number, though, the liberal ones had much more in receipts in both years, to the tune in 2014 of a more than 3-to-1 ratio, 77 to 23%. That 3-to-1 ratio is not inconsistent with information numbers compiled for a March 2017 Manhattan Institute study by Howard Husak. He was just looking at just foundations, not the total receipts of all the groups, but he had a list of 28 top liberal foundations and 28 top conservative foundations and 24 top liberal foundations, and the spending of the liberal ones was, again, at about 3-to-1 ratio. So that's potentially relevant and worth knowing, whether you're on either side, I think, about how you might want to consider giving. So my conclusion to myself is I was wrong, again, in my life. There really probably was no displacement. My question, potential concern about this much discussed and ballyhooed Citizens United case was maybe as overwrought as some of the others have been in other contexts, about which David Keating might tell us overwrought concerns. So that's really all I'm saying. It was not, there was no displacement. Now I do have in my stubbornness other questions, and I don't know, there's no time limit on me here, and I'm not the moderator, but here are other questions I have in the wake of this finding, non-finding. I do still stubbornly wonder whether the nature of policy-oriented C3 activity has changed. And I'm hoping Abby Levine can perhaps help us think through some of that. I have no idea how you would try to quantify whether the nature of C3 giving has changed. But, you know, if anybody has any good ideas, we'd love to pursue them. I'm hoping we can get Gara LaMarche to help us with what would be a proper or a good or effective allocation of funding among the three flows, if one's in a position to either make that decision or advise others on what to consider when making that decision. Now, any reasonable, I mean, I think the answer would probably be, it depends. That would be totally reasonable. On what would it depend? Merely incumbencies at any particular time? Issue specificity? Are there some issues where it might be worth being more political about your giving than others? Is it possible that one side or another is better at using a particular flow? I mean, I don't know. I suppose that could be true. I imagine you're sick of hearing about George Soros' $18 billion, but that would be as a timely example for potential discussion. George Soros, we read, just gave $18 billion, or is going to be devoting that to the third flow. Well, why did he do that? Does he know something conservatives don't? What might conservatives be able to learn from him, or you, Gara? Just three more questions. Does Donald Trump and the 2016 election results make this whole conversation irrelevant? Weren't all sides wrong that year about what to do with your money if you're a giver? How does his ascendance, those results, change what any allocation among the three flows should look like in the future? Should more be given to ideas, broadly categorized as such? Would that have been helpful? Maybe more to one side than the other, I don't know. Second last one, are there implications of this for spend-out decisions on the part of givers? Maybe in particular conservative ones, given the differential in the third flow's numbers there. And then finally, and just pessimistically, because that's where I like to be. It's a good place to be. I think it's usually safe to be pessimistic. Is any honest conversation like this based on assumptions that may no longer apply? Things like evidence matters. You know, there is a truth or there's truth, and people are persuadable in our collective search for it. At any rate, those would be some of my questions and concerns, all of which may very well be as overwrought as my first one there. So I appreciate your hearing me out there and look forward to any conversation that might help us all think through these and other questions.
Great, thank you, Mike. David.
Well, a lot of questions there. I'm not going to try to answer all of them. I'll just make a few observations about the study. I'm sure with some individual donors there was displacement. I don't have any proof of that, but I would imagine that's true. On the other hand, many C3s don't see huge shares of their funding from individual donors. I mean, if it's coming from a foundation that has an endowment, that they're probably not going to shift their temporal focus unless they see an unusual opportunity. And sometimes there are unusual opportunities, but across the board, probably not. So you may have picked up a shift if you'd looked at a subset of the contributions to C3s, contributions from individuals as opposed to just total contributions. But I'm not sure that that would have meant all that much because those contributions might not have been a big share of that pie, and they may have been washed out by other effects. You know, the total amounts available from grant-making foundations may have risen generally, and certainly since the market crash, there has been a rebound in some of these the capacities of some of these foundations. So I'm not really sure the displacement, even if measured, would have been all that meaningful anyway. The second thing that I wanted to just observe about the total numbers given between Democrats and Republicans, whether it's for independent groups or for candidates and political action committees, I think that's pretty much solely a flow of what party is in the minority. And it's always easier to get people to give money when there's this terrible person leading the other party, right? You know, you saw this with the left during the Bush years, 2005, 2006. I mean, those were terrible years for Republicans politically. Same with 2007, 2008. It was really easy to raise money for Democratic candidates running against, you know, Bush's policies. And then flip things over, Obama gets elected, Republicans and conservatives see him as frightening in terms of his policies. And so I think naturally, if you looked at these you know, this surge of support for Democrats and liberals in 2005 to 2008, if you use that as your base period, and then you look at 2011 to 2014 as the other period, well, those were years where Republicans were, you know, on the outs. So it's not at all surprising to me you'd see that shift, and I think that's just simply a matter of, you know, of the political situation. You see this in organizations as well. My guess is the organizations to the left that are policy advocacy groups like C4 groups, which are more dependent on individual funding, they probably had a tougher time raising money when Obama first got elected, and likewise groups on the right probably had an easier job of raising money. So I think a lot of that is you know, based on the current political environment. In terms of how to invest, you know, that would be, I suppose, an interesting job to counsel people with lots of money to give away. But you know, I think it's a mix, and I think you have probably a lot of people are not really willing to look at this carefully enough. But sometimes there's a time for building the intellectual case for things. There's a time for actually trying to address a problem. How would you design a policy to address that problem? It's one thing to get the policy ready, but it doesn't mean politically the environment's ripe for it to pass. But when the environment does produce an opportunity, if no one's done the groundwork in the first place, then there's nothing ready to pass, you know, to make it simple. So I think there's a case for both, but that's to me, there's also a time for short-term investments. If you see a big opportunity, I mean, sometimes things pass by a very small margin. It could be one vote in one chamber or one vote in one committee. And if you don't put everything you can during that time, you may miss a huge opportunity. So that's not only for lobbying activity or advocacy, but also who casts the votes in the first place. I mean, clearly, if you look at the Supreme Court, which I know Abby's group does a lot, the appointments to the Supreme Court and the various circuit courts, I'm sure, would look a lot different if Hillary Clinton were president versus, Trump making the appointments. And likewise, the Senate. We have a fairly closely divided Senate, but clearly you just need a majority vote to confirm nominees at this point to circuit court. And so these short-term investments can, perhaps have big impact. The final thing that I'd like to do to put this all in perspective in terms of at least the election spending is to keep in mind federal campaigns. The total spent was roughly $6.4 billion for the whole cycle. I could compare this to potato chips and pizza and Super Bowl spending, all much less than that. But to me, the more relevant comparison is, well, how much earned media coverage is there of the political campaigns? And to me, those are the really eye-popping numbers. If you want to talk about big money in politics, the big money in politics is in earned media. Trump got $5 billion just in 2016, or the 12 months ending November 1st, in so-called earned media coverage. Now, a lot of it was terrible, I'm sure, but he got a lot of it. Clinton got $3.25 billion, so if you look at the total, that's $8.75 billion just for the presidential candidates in 1 year, compared to the whole cycle for all candidates for Congress and president and all the primaries. So the earned media coverage clearly was a lot more. Trump alone got 647 media mentions in 12 months ending November 1st. And to me, the surprising part of these numbers were when you go back and look at the same equivalent numbers, and these are all from MediaQuant. In 2012, Barack Obama got $1.15 billion worth. Mitt Romney got $700 million. So we're talking about a fourfold increase in earned media coverage. And that's just mentions of and reports on these two presidential candidates. So we have that, but then we have the larger thing where we're not even talking about candidates individually, the culture as a whole. We have music, we have movies, we have all kinds of entertainment. If you were to value up that, it has some impact on policy, I've got to believe, in some fashion. I don't know that anyone's ever tried to tote it up. But I just think it's worth putting these numbers in perspective. People think, oh, look at all the money spent on politics. Yes, there is a lot spent on politics, but there's a lot more spent and a lot more coverage. So, and then to add a little bit more, because a lot of the rhetoric that we see around campaigns and politics is somehow that you can buy elections. Well, you can certainly have an impact, but it's very difficult to move votes, at least in a general election. A lot of the political scientists believe a lot of the advertisements have almost no measurable effect. Well, one would wonder, you look at the political scientists versus the people buying them. Obviously, the people buying them must think they have some effect, but there could also be a psychological effect too, which is people just want to be able to speak their piece, say their piece. Look at how many people make comments after articles and stories. What effect do those comments have? Probably not much at all, right? But people like to do it. And likewise, I think people like to be able to support the candidates or policies of their choosing. So I say let them do it, and thank God we have that opportunity in the United States.
Thank you. Abby.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, and it's great to be here and to talk about this issue. And I think at Alliance for Justice, we're a national association of over 120 organizations representing a broad array of groups committed to progressive values and the creation of an equitable, just, and free society. And as David mentioned, we spend a lot of time looking at the importance of and who sits on the federal bench, as well as working with the nonprofit community to help organizations understand their role. That premised on all of our work is really the belief that people, all of us, should be able to participate and have access to the levers of power and be able to have their voices heard in decisions that are being made about them that will influence them. And we spend, and through the work that I do, we spend a lot of time talking with nonprofit organizations, with different types of tax-exempt organizations all over the country, working on issues of all different types, small organizations, large groups working at the state, local, international level, national level, that traditionally have been 501c3 organizations. And we still work primarily with 501c3 organizations. But we also work increasingly with 501c4 organizations, with labor, with PACs, 527 organizations. And the one thing that we see, and one of the reasons that we have our Bolder Advocacy project and we have our team that does this type of work, is that there is so much misinformation and misunderstanding about what tax-exempt organizations can do, the different types of organizations and the difference between groups like ours and David's that are public charities versus private foundations, the difference between a C3 and a C4, particularly in time when the media often just sort of lumps them all together as nonprofits or tax-exempt organizations. And so just as there's so much misinformation about what tax-exempt organizations can do, there's just as much, if not possibly even more, about what the campaign finance rules are. And I was just looking at some studies or some research that some political scientists have done over the last year or two, talking to people about public opinion polls about what people's views are for campaign finance reform. And everybody thinks, oh, we should have campaign finance reform. Yes, we should ban corporations from directly spending on federal campaigns or candidates. And it's like, well, that's already the law. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding about what organizations and what people and corporations can do. And so we spend a lot of our time talking with groups and really helping to demystify the process and really encouraging organizations to be advocates. And the whole notion of our program is that we want nonprofit organizations, whether it's a C3, a C4, a political organization, to be bold advocates. And so we believe very firmly in that role for all types of organizations. And as I was thinking about sort of the survey and the study and thinking about the role that 501c3s should play, I thought I would sort of highlight some of the trends that we've been seeing. And these are very unscientific, sort of anecdotal trends, but that we've seen since the Citizens United decision. And I'm not sure whether there's necessarily any correlation. Many of these trends have been exacerbated by the Trump administration and the Trump victory. But we have been seeing, and sort of not surprisingly with some of your spending, an increase in advocacy by 501c3 organizations. And when we talk about advocacy, we're talking about everything from lobbying, but most of the advocacy isn't lobbying. Some of it may be civic engagement work or voter registration, get out the vote, candidate forums, other kinds of activity in elections. Some of it is doing research and data on issues. And we've seen organizations all across the issue spectrum, many of whom had traditionally been service providers, providing tutoring programs or meals for people who are homeless, recognizing that they need to speak out on the issues that affect them. And so we've seen an increase in advocacy by more types of organizations and just by more organizations, as well as organizations really increasing the types of advocacy that they've been doing. And so again, we've seen more organizations getting involved in lobbying, more organizations getting involved in voter engagement activities and participating in nonpartisan ways in the election process. More groups getting involved in ballot measures, but also and this has been in the last few years in particular, more C3s getting involved in litigation and in nominations for both judicial races or judicial nominations, as well as for other executive branch nominations. But we've also seen, sort of with that and the increase in advocacy by C3s, we've started seeing more organizations creating C4s. And again, particularly on the progressive side, that's been sort of a slow, there have been some even before Citizens United, and we've started to see more as groups are recognizing that we need to use all of the tools available, and thinking about the issue of different flows of money, that while giving to candidates may be, and for individuals, giving to candidates may be good, that sort of lasts only for one election cycle, where C4s, on the other hand, that are really issue-based organizations, can help build the groundwork and be there day in, day out, through election cycles, to be able to focus on the issues that are important to them. And just as we've seen sort of an increase in advocacy by C3s, we've also been seeing, and this has really been through since the Trump election or through the 2016 election season, sort of an increase in advocacy by private foundations. And again, not lobbying, not sort of making sure or they're making sure they're staying within the bounds of what they can do, but of more foundations making statements on policy issues, whether it's issues about denouncing racism or DACA or health access, really talking about the issues that are core to their missions. And I think through some of this is that so many of the issues that organizations care about and that are really core to their missions and to the values of the organization have become politicized and have become sort of more central to policy debates, where as opposed to some organizations going out and saying, oh, we want to get more involved in policy, or we want to take positions, or even we think of ourselves as political or conservative, that issues that groups work on, whether it's climate and environmental issues or education or immunizations, that so many of the issues have become political. And so groups are really working to sort of through that. And I think the other issue, and we can talk more about this as well, is that we spend a lot of time talking to organizations about the language, and even what do we mean by something being political. And as we talk to lots of 501c3s or their board members or to funders, and they say, well, we can't get involved, we don't want to support advocacy because we can't be political. And recognizing that that term, just as terms like dark money or even terms like lobbying, are often used or nonprofit, are often used very broadly, that oftentimes we're having conversations using the same words with different organizations meaning very different things. And so for a lot of the work that, as we see C3s are doing, again, they're talking about the policies, they're talking about the issues that they were created to do. And some of it's been labeled political, but not necessarily of what the organizations started out to do. And those are some of the trends that and I guess the other piece that I would say with 501c3s where we've seen a real difference has to be with some of the changing technology and with the use of social media, that we've seen a lot more different type of activity available to different types of organizations. And so while TV and while radio ads and TV ads are still important, so is the use of Twitter and Facebook and all of the other kinds of social media that I don't understand and don't use, but that as different organizations are experimenting and trying different ways to communicate with people in their communities, that's sort of raised the level of various conversations and allowed them to have more robust conversations about some of the issues.
Thank you, Abby. Gara?
Thanks. It's very good to be here and at the Capital Research Center and sponsored by the Capital Research Center. I have been the target over the years of research by the Capital Research Center, and I'm happy to see the quality of the research continue to improve. So, so I'm happy to be here. A little bit about my own odyssey, for whatever it's worth, in the last 40 years. I started out life with the American Civil Liberties Union, where I worked for about 12 years, and then I was in the international human rights movement with Human Rights Watch, and then I went over to the dark side of philanthropy, and I started George Soros' Philanthropy in the United States in 1996, and ran that for 11 years. And then I was the president of a global foundation called Atlantic Philanthropies, and now I have a job running a group called the Democracy Alliance, which is an organization of various kinds of progressive donors, many of them political donors, but some of them have broader interests, and we advise them on their giving. So I do want to take up your questions, and I want to talk about it in kind of two ways. Both of them slightly autobiographical, because on the question of the data, I read the study. Most of you sitting here will not have read it, right? It's available here, right? So
yes.
It's, yeah. So, and you know, there is. I'm not a statistical expert, nor am I a campaign finance reform expert. I do think sometimes when I read these things, that it would be good to have some kind of cross-ideological compact on data, you know, because we often count things differently, you know. If you're on the left, you say, well, you're counting X, which I don't really think of as left, you know, or there are foundations that I'm not that familiar with, and I'm sure you have the same complaints about the data that comes from the right. And in fact, over the years, I think, particularly with respect to conservative philanthropy, that the left has often overstated the dollar impact of conservative philanthropy, not necessarily the impact, but there's no question that if you're just looking at established foundations, that the left, even by a more conservative measure what the left is, I mean conservative in a small c, non-ideological kind of way, there are more resources on the left than there are on the right. That doesn't apply across the board to everything, but it does apply to foundations. So I sometimes think it would be nice if we had some task force that got set up where you all could agree on how to count things, and then we could argue over what was counted. So, but I'm not gonna go too more deeply into that. So the two things, one is, you know, so when I went to work for Soros in 1996, I was heavily kind of influenced, and Bill knows this because we've talked a lot over the years, and I've been in a lot of Hudson Bradley Center forums. You know, I admired, you may surprise you to know, the work of conservative foundations, Bradley and Olin and Scaife. They seem to me to be a model for policy-engaged foundations, you know, who had a point of view and also policy changes that they wished to see, and they made robust and, you know, appropriate use of the resources philanthropically to advance things like school choice, or to advance things like welfare reform, or to, in the case of the Olin Foundation, for instance, to spark a significant movement on the right with respect to judges and the courts, that people like, you know, Abby's organization and I are having to deal with the consequences of to this day. So, and some of what we did was actually try to take a page from the style, the operating style of those foundations. And I indeed have had and have good kind of collegial relationships with my colleagues on the right, because while it is true that Bill and I disagree on a lot of policy questions, we actually think quite a lot alike about the kind of vices and virtues of philanthropy, you know, and the way philanthropy ought to be done. So, and there's a lot of common cause there. So I think the lessons that I learned from conservative philanthropy, among the ones, in addition to the ones I just mentioned, were staying power, you know, and kind of long-term thinking. And I think a much more interesting discussion can be had about the way philanthropy and giving plays into the kind of ideological battles of our time, if it is focused on the way money is spent as opposed to the amounts of money that are spent. I mean, we can have a discussion about the amounts of money that are spent, and I continue to think that in the political system too much money washes around. But I think that the effectiveness over the years of conservative philanthropy owes more to the way they went about the philanthropy than to the kind of raw dollar amounts. And that has to do with things like investment in ideas. It has to do with investment in people and leadership. I mean, it's still the case on the left that we underinvest in leadership development substantially. It has to do with a belief that strong organizations and institutions, but not too many of them, but key institutions need to be built and kind of nurtured over a period of years. So I often tell a kind of a joke about right-wing and left-wing approaches to philanthropy, which is that in the larger society, the right, for instance, I'm caricaturing here, but we'll say the welfare mother, let's get that person off welfare and pull them up by their own bootstraps, and the government shouldn't be coddling people. And the left has a different view, right, of income supports and all the kinds of things that we believe need to help lift people out of poverty. When it comes to their attitudes about philanthropy, the right and the left reverse roles. So it's a welfare state, for the grantees of conservative philanthropy, and with no cutoffs at all. And the left is like, well, we gave you 3 years of funding, that's it, go find something else. And I think that has something to do with why in this kind of great contest of ideas, the left has often over the years been less effective, because the spending of the progressive groups is often diffused among a great number of groups. It often isn't as leadership focused. It often is more issue focused than institutionally focused. Some would say it's more identity focused. And I have views on all those things, but I think that that's an interesting discussion to have. So I tried in being the I guess a significant practitioner of progressive philanthropy, to learn what I could from the right. Now I want to shift for a minute and talk a little bit about George Soros by way of illustrating some of these points. So, and I'm not authorized to speak for George Soros. I used to work for him. I'm on one of his boards. But I speak for myself from my observation of Soros over a number of years, and understanding that Soros is, for many people, kind of a boogeyman on the other side of the ideological spectrum. So Soros, was a successful investor, made a lot of money, wasn't philanthropically active until the late 1980s in any significant way. Started his foundation, began to spend more time in the foundation increasingly than in the business. Originally, because he's from Hungary and grew up under communism and Nazism, his philanthropy took a focus on what he called open societies, very heavily influenced, as some of you know, by the work of Karl Popper. And he was about simply trying to have open societies. And so his initial forays into philanthropy were mostly in the former Soviet world, and initially focused on some very practical things like fax machines for dissidents and things like that. Over time, when the Berlin Wall fell and the whole Soviet sphere was open for a different kind of business, Soros's work in that part of the world was really aimed at trying to foster the institutions of a free society that had been atrophied over the long period of communist rule. Independent media, courts, arts and culture, those kinds of things. I wouldn't say that it had any kind of particular ideological cast to it, except that he wanted to foster the institutions of open society and democracy that had been atrophied. So a small example of that, which influenced me quite heavily, was that he had a network of debate clubs throughout Eastern Europe, because in those societies, no one was in the habit. It was very dangerous, actually, to argue against the government or to have an independent point of view, and he wanted to inculcate those kinds of habits. In building the United States program some years later, I drew on that for a different reason. I was a high school debater myself at a Catholic high school in New England. It was very critical to my own kind of formation. I looked around at inner city high schools and found that there was virtually no debate programs in those places. And we supported a network of urban debate leagues. And I noticed with great pride a couple of years ago that one of these teams of all black and Latino kids from inner city high school had won the national championship and was in an Oval Office picture with the president. So I felt that was a good return on investment. So. But back to Soros, he then at a certain point came to feel that open society in the United States was not sufficiently robust, even though he had originally not wanted to focus on the United States. And originally we focused on issues that he thought were kind of taboo topics, you know, death and dying, how to kind of help foster more of a discussion about end-of-life care, or drug policy, for instance, an issue in which he's always had a lot in common with certain libertarians, you know, George Schultz and various people like that have been very strong in drug policy reform. I'm not going to, you don't have time and are probably not interested in, or maybe you are, but I don't have time to go through the whole Soros saga, but I want to skip ahead to 2004. So Soros was very much engaged philanthropically along open society grounds. It may surprise some people to know that he isn't actually a very ideological person. And that we were constantly urged to make sure that we looked at the unintended consequences of what we were funding. So he was very interested in money in politics, but very suspicious of any remedy about money in politics that couldn't be gamed and recreate the problem. Same is true of the criminal justice system issues. He was always been very interested in trying to push the envelope about being open to the possibility that what we're doing is failing or isn't working. Now, I wasn't involved directly in what I'm about to discuss because I ran the C3 Foundation. But in 2004, or 3 and 4, he began to feel that the presidency of George Bush, which he viewed with great dismay, both in terms of the Iraq War and the international work, but also what was happening in the domestic scene, was a threat to many of the values that the foundation held. And after September 11th of 2001, for instance, we'd invested quite heavily in civil liberties issues, you know, that grew out of the 9/11 attacks. And so he became politically active, actually, for the first time in his life. He probably gave money at a relatively inconsequential level to candidates, but he began to be more active and more strategic about it and built a little political operation out of, you know, not out of the foundation, obviously. In the peak year in which he spent political money, 2004, he spent $27 million, you know. That would be a rounding error for Sheldon Adelson or the Koch brothers. And now, my understanding is, you know, that his political spending in any given year, and this is not just candidate spending, it's often kind of infrastructure groups like America Votes or whatever, you know, is in the neighborhood of 25 million. Not nothing, but hardly overwhelming. He was driven to that, and this gets to the question of how do you advise people about how to spend their money. He was driven to that by the notion that all the philanthropic investments, or many of the philanthropic investments, were impaired by the political environment, and he kind of made an ROI kind of consideration that if he could play some part in changing the national administration, there would be a more conducive environment for the things he cared about philanthropically. Now, some people follow that course, and some people don't. A lot of the great philanthropists, you know, the Gateses and so on of the world, you know, are not that interested in politics and don't seem to play in the political sphere in that way, although almost always they become over time more interested in policy. So a lot of these technocratic people wake up one morning and realize that everything is not a big science problem, that policy has, you know, some kind of impact on it, and they become interested in school reform or public health policy or things like that, or foreign aid, you know. And so Soros had that kind of an odyssey, you know. So, you know, he remains involved in politics, although less interested in it, you know, than he once was. But for him, it was a piece of an overall picture about how he looked at his giving. So I guess I would say that donors, you know, need to look at what they're trying to accomplish in the world. I mean, you know, what kind of change are you trying to see, or what kind of change are you trying to stop? And then you look at the mix of tools along the spectrum of C3, C4, PAC, whatever, and you decide what the right mix is for you. I will say, and just to round up, because I'm sure we'll have a great discussion about this, that I think While I have a job now of working with mostly political donors around civic engagement in elections and the infrastructure around elections, I actually believe that the longer-term investments in policy and leadership development are the most important things that donors can do, which are almost always capable of being funded, through tax-exempt dollars. And I think the left, to the extent that we have neglected that and had to play catch-up with the right, made a mistake, and to this day I think underinvest in that. For instance, we will at some point regain power. I hope that doesn't shock too many people. At the federal level or various state houses, maybe as soon as this fall in some jurisdictions. And you have to be ready to govern. You have to have policies. You have to know what you're about. You can't wake up in the morning and wonder what to do the first day. And the fact that the Heritage Foundation and the Manhattan Institute, had blueprints for Reagan and Giuliani respectively, had a great deal to do with their effectiveness. And we're beginning to build some of that on the left, but we don't have enough of it. I think to the extent that I see folks on the right eschewing investment in long-term idea development and leadership development and infrastructure building for short-term political gains, I think that's a mistake, but one I'm happy to see that they're making.
Right. Thanks, Gara. Thanks very much. Let me, and certainly you all should feel free to respond to each other if something has been particularly provocative, but to go back to, I think, Mike's first question, something like that first question, which was, is there something about the charitable sector that we should really respect? And by that I mean probably pretty much C3s and private foundations. Is there some sphere that they should inhabit and sort of keep themselves within? Or should they in fact feel free to venture into the political world to the maximum of their legal capacities and align themselves with the more political groups? I think what prompted Mike's sort of initial inquiry into this, and it resonated with my experience, was the notion that more and more C3s and foundations, and Gara, you just referred to it, were in fact beginning to sort of turn their back. Yeah, we were getting more and more things from people who were governing these decisions finally. Questions like, well, what is this, like just another book? Or is this just another conference? Or is it another white paper? Why do we keep doing all this crap when, those guys over there are beating us about the head and ears at the polls, So then, the natural inclination is to try to push one's group as close as one can to an immediate political outcome, and forget about these boring books and boring conferences, and let's really have some clear and concrete results. Is there? I mean, is that I guess I'm asking a should question here. Is this something that should happen, or are we in fact abusing the charitable status when we insist that we extract every ounce of politics out of it? Now, Abby, I know that this is, probably most directly aimed at the kind of work you do, because and it's, a number of groups on the right have done the same thing. In other words, you're trying to wring every last ounce of political activism out of the folks that you work with.
Well, I would say policy. I would not characterize it as political activism,
right.
And I think, again, that's a term that is used in very different ways, and I think for many people, political is thinking about electioneering and thinking about influencing who sits in office, and that is important, but I think there's a whole lot of policy work that needs to be done, and a lot of the research and setting the stage that needs to be done before we even get there. And in many ways, I think as we work with C3s, both public charities and private foundations. One of the bigger issues is that many organizations do a lot less than they can, and particularly many of the groups, we're constantly urging them that they can do more, and that it's okay if they call a legislator every now and then. It's okay if a private foundation makes a grant without restricting the use of funds for lobbying. And so while there are some groups, some C3s that are really pushing the envelope and going right up to the line, which is great.
Or over it.
Or there's some that may be going over, hopefully not. Or groups that are creating C4s to really be able to maximize. That I think one of the bigger issues is that there are too many groups that are self-censoring or sitting on the sidelines and not talking about the issues and being able to use the data and the research that they have to talk about policy issues.
Yeah,
I would agree with almost everything that Gara said. I think you've got to have people out there thinking of policy and, looking at problems that our society faces, looking at problems our governments face, and trying to think through sensible solutions. Now, different people are going to come up with different solutions. And it's kind of what I said. You've got to have these solutions ready so when the environment's right, someone can do it. I think what he said about mandate for leadership, or the Giuliani administration's having these, proposals, ready to go with evidence and arguments for them, it's got to be really helpful, for people. And, surprise, surprise, a lot of people that run for office don't really have they just like being in office. There's something about the ego of being, a big shot congressman. I think some of them run because their spouses want them to run. So they don't really know what they're doing. They need some help, really, when they get in. What is that movie? We got elected, now what do we do, right?
Right.
So I think there's a point for both. Now, in terms of trying to actually affect who gets elected, the first thing I would say to people is don't waste your time with C3s and C4s. If you want to try to influence the election campaigns, then get in and do it directly. It's very inefficient, I think, to use a C3. Very, very risky to the C3, risky to the donor. C4s, it's very difficult to do. If you're earmarking your money for the ads, it's not clear that you can or can't do this. And in any event, the group can't spend more than half of its money on electioneering anyway, so it's a very inefficient way to do it. And if you give it to a particular PAC, then you can say, I want you to spend it in this race, or start up your own PAC and just work in that particular race. So I would say stay away from the C3s. It's just going to be inefficient and perhaps cause a lot of trouble for them.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I think part of the virtue, the perceived virtue of using a C3 and a private foundation is that there's a sort of aura of objectivity still about a lot of those institutions. I mean, we were, for much of the early 20th century, we regarded the handful of think tanks and research universities and private foundations as being, sort of above the partisan fray, and people continue to sort of capitalize on that notion of nonpartisanship and hope that carries some aura of authority that an explicitly political attempt would not have. But maybe is there some reaction to that? Is there some?
Well, I think that gets back to Abby's comment about what's political and what isn't. I mean, different people mean different things by that word. So
Yeah, gotcha.
Well, I think you can have a point of view. Well, I mean, I think that one of the things the C3 world does is kind of force people into pretending that they don't have an ideology, So, I mean, so ideology is fine. It's out there. Some people are non-ideological or transpartisan. Some of us are more on one side or the other of an ideological spectrum. I don't think it follows that if you have a point of view or according to ideology, that your research needs to be skewed to that. Your research, you come from a conservative perspective, but your research has to be able to stand up, and be scrutinized by people, and and you want that, and I don't want to live in a world, just as I don't want to live in a world of fake news and bots driving everything. I don't want to live in a world where you choose the research that you like, or I realize that realistically we're moving toward that polarized world, but which is why I kind of half-jokingly said at the beginning we should have some kind of trans ideological compact, at least on what we're measuring, and then we can argue about the differences with it. I think. Thanks for your support for my, my views about long-term thinking. I do think, though, that, of course, who's in office affects whether those blueprints can happen. So, for instance, to take an issue dear to the hearts of Abby and me, Gorsuch sits on the court today because of politics, right? Because of who happened to be sitting in the majority leader's seat, and the kind of bare-knuckle tactics of holding the seat open, until a Republican president could be nominated. So you can have all the, judicial, all the Federalist Society think tanking and brainstorming you want in the world, but if you don't win elections and then use those powers in order to to get nominees on, or if you don't win the election and get to pass the Affordable Care Act, or win an election and get to pass the huge tax cut bill, as we always say, elections have consequences. So each donor has to make their own judgment about where they want to invest, and you may make a very good point about the efficiency or inefficiency of C3, C4 vehicles, for politics. I mean, C3 vehicles obviously shouldn't be used for politics, and C4 vehicles, can't endorse or elect candidates either. But I'm with Abby in that I think that we should be careful not to conflate the word political or partisan with, if you will, kind of ideological. So a foundation which decides to invest in voter registration of underrepresented communities is not, in my view, an inherently partisan act, although it is, in some broad sense, a political act, because it's about empowering people to participate in the political system, but it's not telling them how to vote.
Gotcha. Very good. Do we have a microphone for good? We do have a microphone for now. We're going to take questions from the audience, and now let me urge you to do this. Really have a question, and get to it within 30 seconds of the comment, and B, well, three things. B, identify. It should have been A. Identify yourself and your affiliation, please. But finally, the temptation in these kinds of situations is to tell us about what your organization is doing, which may or may not be related to the topic of the panel. Please forego that if you can, and really have a question and really have it relating to this panel. I hope I haven't totally suppressed the audience interest at that point, but yes, let's go here.
Hi there, David Thompson, National Council of Nonprofits. I'm only going to break your rule by saying we represent frontline nonprofits. We are not a think tank.
Right.
So this is relevant. Bill Sideways asked his first question. Let me ask directly to start with Mike. You had three groups in your study. The C3s were the third group that are not partisan, to use Abby's correct definition, and you defined it very well. What if we blow up that distinction? Repealing the Johnston Amendment, repealing the third clause of 501c3, so that foundations that are funding C3s can only pick those that are endorsing candidates of their choosing, or endorsing candidates themselves, and inflicting their will on any grantee has to endorse candidates as well. How does that change your numbers?
Well, I don't know, I have to say. Right. Yeah. And that would be difficult even to, I mean, how would you try to really answer that question? It's a thought experiment.
Yeah.
And the answer has, I mean, it is a hypothetical. I have to just say, I don't know.
The House tax bill would have done that.
Oh, no,
Well-
no, come on. Let's be fair here. The bill did not repeal the Johnson Amendment. That's a total mischaracterization.
Just
of
tell us what the
it does.
Johnson Amendment
The
is.
Johnson Amendment says that a 501c3, which is a public charity, that's part of the problem with the Johnson Amendment. No one knows where it starts or stops. Clearly, 501c3 organizations are not allowed to spend money encouraging people to vote for or against candidates. They're not allowed to give money to candidates. They're not allowed to give money to party committees, and they're not allowed to independently advocate. What was in the House tax bill was something that said basically de minimis expenditures could be done. It was primarily aimed at churches that could endorse candidates. 501c3s were not going to be turned into super PACs by the House bill. That was not part of the proposal. Now it is theoretically possible to say, hey, we could make PACs tax deductible. I mean, there are things out there saying the government should give money to candidates. In some cities, they're giving out $6 tax dollars for every dollar raised by a candidate. So that's a bigger subsidy than a tax deduction. In Australia, there's no contribution limits to candidates, and the government lets you deduct, I think, as much as $20,000 in tax deductible contributions to candidates and parties. So how all that would play out in the United States, I have no idea. But what was contemplated is not a repeal of the Johnson Amendment, but it's only to, basically allow preachers from the pulpit or individual groups to make endorsements, but not to spend any money. So,
Anybody else on the Johnson Amendment while we're here?
I would
Abby?
say, but that bill was very inartfully drafted, and that's where, again, C3s have an important role in being able to sort of talk about what the implications are, but then also to be able to talk about how to improve it or how to look at what it means, and then to
the Johnson Amendment, if you were to start and write it, you wouldn't write it the way it's written.
There are bills that have done that.
There are a lot of, actually,
Yeah.
I haven't seen a bill
This
that's
year.
gotten it right yet, exactly. But, I mean, there are a lot of other problems with the Johnson, not just people who were, preaching from the pulpit, which I think is an obvious thing to exempt. But we have a lot of journalism today is funded by 501c3 organizations. Are we saying a 501c3 investigative outfit in a state can't publish information about a candidate? That's what the Johnson Amendment, I think, says, because it covers the publishing of statements about candidates. And if you have an investigative journalism outfit, finds something shocking about a candidate, under the Johnson Amendment, presumably be highly risky to publish that.
But,
huh? Yes.
David,
You disagree?
your larger point, though, right, it goes to I think, again, to Mike's first question, which is it a healthy state of affairs when our nonprofit sector in general, right, the sector that your group represents, becomes so political, right, that, and as your group often describes it, that you end up with Republican nonprofits and Democrat nonprofits, so, alternative ways of delivering services depending on one's political or ideological inclinations, right? So that was, that was behind your question, was it not? Something like that. And that, I guess, was I think our panel seems to be pretty confident that that's okay, right? That the politicization, the drift of the nonprofit sector into politics understood in its broadest sense is more or less all right. Not partisanship, which is illegal, but I mean.
But look, the more the nonprofit sector became yet another part of American life, which was completely polarized, where people kind of line up and choose, the worse it is for all of us and for the nonprofit sector. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think that would be quite regrettable, and I don't know that I see that trend particularly, but it would be regrettable. However, I think the extent to which the nonprofit, I mean, I've devoted a good deal of my own career, and so has Abby, to encouraging nonprofits and foundations to engage in the support of advocacy that is non-political or partisan, and the civic engagement of nonprofits on within those rules on issues of public concern that are central to their mission, I think is a good thing. So it may be that I'm making a distinction that is increasingly difficult to uphold. You know, I don't know, but I believe strongly in the distinction that you can do it without just making nonprofits, you know, combatants in the ideological wars or the political partisan wars that we have going on here.
Okay, yeah. Yes, please, I think you had your...
My name is Joe Freeman, and I'd like to ask about the spillover effects of Citizens United. Monday, I was out front of the Supreme Court, where Janus versus ASME was being argued inside, and I was listening to the speakers duke it out on the outside. And as I understand the Janus argument, it's essentially that speech is political, thanks to Citizens United, and therefore any money given to a union that's not purely voluntary is political speech and therefore unconstitutional. And of course, Janus was backed by quite a few conservative nonprofit, legal and otherwise foundations. What other spillover effects are we seeing from Citizens United? How else is it being used to essentially achieve a political goal, in this case undermining unions, under the guise of constitutional free speech?
Panelists, please jump in here.
Well, I mean, the Janus case, I would be surprised if the courts would use the Citizens United decision as the backing for a decision on Janus. Now, that's not to say Janus doesn't have First Amendment implications. It certainly does. But it's a matter of the concept of compelled speech. And it seems pretty well settled that unions cannot use mandatory dues for politics. What's being discussed here is more lobbying advocacy. And I don't want to get too deeply into the case because I don't consider myself an expert in the case, but there is one line that's been drawn that seems accepted even by, I think, the unions, is that the fees can't be used for actual support or opposition of candidates. But the Janus case is more a question of lobbying and advocacy about what policies the government should do. So, I mean, obviously that's an important question too, but it's not just about candidates.
Anyone else?
I would also say
Yeah.
that I think Citizens United in many ways has become this big boogeyman for sort of all things bad with government and sort of the notion of corrupt government. And I think as we looked at campaign finance even before Citizens United, that it was not necessarily the way we would want it, or it was not the best use of money, and looking at sort of whether there was a sense of corruption or whether sort of money was being spent inappropriately. And so I think in some way the case itself has created a lot of energy and a lot of activism sort of about whether to abolish the decision or other things, where I think some of that conversation could be spent in more productive ways in terms of looking at some actual types of reform that are much more likely and would actually change some of the behaviors that people are unhappy with.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, and actually I'll ask that as a question to the other panelists. You really do hear the phrase, in the wake of Citizens United, comma, then the worst thing that has happened in the last 8 years follows that phrase, because somehow Citizens United is the source of a great deal, apparently, of the evil that afflicts the country. Is that true? Is that, I mean, or let me ask you this. How, I mean, is that just a wildly overblown description of this, or is there some truth to it? I mean, you hear it so often, surely there must be some element of truth that Citizens United is responsible for some of today's evils. Mike.
Well, I had thought in the wake of Citizens United there might have been an ill effect in the C3 context,
Yeah,
and
right.
found really
I see.
probably not.
Yeah, gotcha.
So I would have to search my mind. I think it was a boogeyman. I was misled by that phrase.
Gotcha. So you fell for it.
I fell for it.
But you actually looked at the numbers and you
Yeah,
changed
thank
your
you.
mind. Okay.
Yes.
Excellent.
Now the nature of C3s might have changed because that's clearly been, but okay.
Right. I was
But the
gonna say-
clause is what got me.
Okay.
Yeah.
The clause.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Gara.
Well, whenever you make a change at that level that affects the rules around, political spending, you affect the ecosystem and things happen, and you've studied some part of that. But, in the world in which I live more these days, political parties are relatively weak, independent groups are relatively strong, that's not happening in a vacuum, So I'm less concerned, and you're probably right, and I'm on tape, so I'll be careful about how I say this, but it's probably the case that every single ill attributed to Citizens United is not due to it, the Ebola virus and so on. So I feel comfortable saying that. But
Right.
But what I was going to say was prompted really by some of the earlier remarks. I think and by your question about Janice, which is, I think that we could use some deeper discussions, again, across ideological lines, around freedom of speech in the contemporary era. So, I started out my career as a free speech defender. I've logged my hours debating Nazis and Skokie and all those kinds of things. And I find myself more interested in the First Amendment now because I think there is the right and the left have shifted roles a little bit, but particularly around some of the campus, speech incidents. And I don't like to see, people on the left taking the bait of right-wing provocateurs and letting that happen because I believe strongly in freedom of speech. And I think all these issues around, if you will, government speech or funding, where there is reasonably settled law in some of the cases, but they're all of a piece. So whether the union dues issue, you'd characterized earlier public financing in New York as in effect, the government subsidization of speech. I don't look at it that way, but I could see that there's a discussion to be had that way. The global gag rule. Giuliani tried to kind of clumsily to ban some piece of artwork at the Brooklyn Museum because of its tax subsidy, and public libraries and public schools. And so it's along a spectrum. All of those things involve speech, but also some level of, so it's, you don't want the government. This is one of the problems I kind of have with in raising the questions I have. We're not discussing them here today, but an article I wrote is out there about foundations in democracy, about whether the tax exemption itself, in effect, confers a special status on foundations that enables them to have, more power in a democratic society than they ought to have. So I'll answer this not so much to I don't know about the Janus Citizens United connection, but I think the spectrum of issues that have emerged in this society around speech, including that which is where there may be some perceived government endorsement because of the money is flowing from government funds. I think those deserve a lot more discussion now than they've had in recent years, and I would like to be part of a trans-ideological discussion about it.
And I think because so many of these issues have become so politicized, and it's either you're with us, you're against us, you're for Citizens United, you're not, we haven't been able to have some of those real conversations about what are the actual problems. What are we trying to remedy, and what are ways to do that? And that people, and I think Citizens United is just such a perfect example of that, of this knee-jerk, it's good, it's either the worst decision ever or it's the best decision ever, as opposed to sitting around and really talking about some of these issues. And I think for too many issues, we're having that problem where it's either good or bad, you're with us, you're against us, as opposed to, good old debating clubs or people sitting around and saying, all right, what is an actual problem? And let's come up with ways to solve it.
And I think that, you know, these issues around money and politics have posed special challenges for the left, because people on the left in general think that money should be less important in politics. So a guy like George Soros wants campaign finance reform, and a lot of my donors want campaign finance reform, but they're not particularly interested in unilateral disarmament, you know, while we have the rules that we have. And so if you're on the progressive side, you know, you're constantly having to explain the irony of that, or being hoisted on your own petard, where it's not really a problem on the right, because if you believe in kind of unfettered, you know, flow of money in politics, your self-interest and your ideological point of view combined, and it's a little more challenging for people on the left to live in the current system.
A couple of observations about this. One is, if you look at when the Citizens United decision came out, virtually all the hypotheticals and scary things that were predicted, basically corporations were going to take over politics, was the primary one. None of that has come true. And so, you know, to the extent that I think it has had harm, I think it's because the decision, when it discussed disclosure issues, was so jumbled, so, you know, not terribly well considered, that it's caused a massive state of confusion in the courts, in the circuit courts, about what's permissible and what isn't. And there are a lot of right to privacy questions that now are unresolved, that, you know, and haven't been resolved since the McConnell case. And I think these are really important and serious questions. And there's a very, you know, as David French put it, probably one of the most important cases no one's heard of is in New York State. There's the New York Civil Liberties Union, the American Civil Liberties Union, Citizens Union, which has absolutely nothing to do with Citizens United. It's a very well-regarded independent watchdog group in New York City, have sued New York, because New York has passed a law that basically, I may be exaggerating slightly, but not terribly much, if you say anything about any matter of public policy, then you have to report to the state and the public your donors. And if you're a 501c3 that's in some way that you've somehow subsidized to some trivial amount an organization that says something about policy in New York, you also have to disclose your donors. It's so bad that if our group represented a lobbying group on a pro bono basis in court, that would be considered arguably a subsidy, and then we would therefore have to disclose all our donors. So this case is going ahead, and, you know, I don't know where it will wind up, but I think there's some really serious questions here.
We have, what, a couple minutes left, and I think unless Scott, who paid for this microphone, is going to insist on getting in the last question. Is that the idea, Scott? Okay, yes.
It's the injustice of money.
Yes, exactly, right, yes.
Thanks. I actually wanted to key off something that Mike said at the beginning, that C3 foundations can't have to only give to C3s, which I don't think is precisely legally correct, because my question is to Gara, and this is on this interesting question you guys have handled so well about what's the right cocktail of political giving, independent giving, C3 giving, and also the differences in the left and the right, because there are significant ones. And Gara, when you were at Atlantic Philanthropies, you put tens of millions of dollars of that foundation money. Now, it was in Bermuda, so I'm not sure how much that made a difference. But you invested tens of millions into Healthcare for America Now, which was the leading umbrella group lobbying for Obamacare, and then got invited to for the signing when essentially the campaign did succeed in its policy goal.
Ceremony.
Yes.
Not the Oval Office signing.
Yes.
So,
but
I'd have to give $100 million for that.
Yeah. Injustice again. But the point is, you thought since then. Well, I shouldn't say since then, but I'm not quite clear of the timing. But Atlantic Philanthropies continues to give in the tens of millions of dollars to C4s. Yeah. And in fact, it created at least 3 that I'm aware of. And if I understand correctly, at least one of them is intended to encourage other foundations who wouldn't be in Bermuda to be giving into the C4 stream of money. And so I was just fascinated to hear your thoughts on that, because first of all, I don't think there's much in the way of right-wing giving like that, which is explained or exemplified by a 20-year Bradley veteran starting to think that he couldn't even do it. And why you thought then that that's a valuable thing, and any speculation about how it continues to be valuable.
Well, Atlantic, has spent down its assets, so it's not. I left Atlantic in 2011, so but it's now just spending down its assets, so it's not giving anymore. One of the things that spun off was a group that is a kind of a C4 funder, which itself has a limited lifespan. Atlantic had as Abby was making a side comment about a kind of complicated tax status, being chartered in Bermuda, so it gave us a lot more leeway to do what would be traditionally considered C4 spending than other foundations. So while we encouraged C3 foundations to go to the max of what they could legally do with respect to advocacy, we could do more than that, and we funded lobbying, and we funded some ballot initiatives and whatever we could fund. And Atlantic was an unusual institution in that, with an unusual set of tools for that reason. And you're right, we put a considerable amount of money into advocacy for the Affordable Care Act. There isn't much organized C4 money. I can only speak on the progressive side, like there is C3 money. So the Open Society Policy Center, which is an arm of Soros, whose board I'm on, is a funder of C4 efforts, with his post-tax money. It
itself is a C4.
It's a C4, yeah. It's a very, the scale of the I don't remember the exact budget, but it's in the single-digit millions of dollars. I mean, it's dwarfed by, I never got your $18 billion question, but which is about endowing his foundation, essentially. I mean, that's really what it's about. So, in perpetuity, it doesn't have much to do with political work. And then, I don't know, there have been a couple of other foundations that have been organized around C4. So I believe if you have a set of tools that permits you to do legally more express advocacy around referenda and lobbying, then you should make use of them. And they hired me at Atlantic in the first place because, they thought I would make more robust use of those tools, which I tried to do. But we're not encouraging other foundations to fund lobbying, because that's a good way to get in trouble with the law.
Inefficient as David Keating would.
Right.
Now, did you win the high school debating? How'd your high school debating team do?
I wasn't really that good a high school debater because I was kind of lazy. But what it did teach me was we had switch side debating. So you had to get up in one day and argue, for the draft, and another day and argue against the draft, and that's a tremendous intellectual discipline.
That's great. Okay, well, we are out of time, as I understand it, so let's give our panel a round of applause.